The night I found him, I almost shot him. I had my hand on the grip of my old service pistol, the .45 I carried for 22 years in the Army, and my finger was maybe half an inch from doing something I couldn't take back. He was sitting in the corner of my basement, completely still, holding a flashlight pointed at the floor. 70 years old if he was a day. White hair, work boots, a green canvas jacket so old the elbows had worn through to the lining. He looked up at me and said, calm as a man reading the Sunday paper, "I wondered when you'd finally come back. I need to back up. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I did 22 years in the United States Army Infantry, then logistics, then the kind of desk work that nobody makes movies about but somebody has to do. I retired as a sergeant major out of Fort Campbell in 2019. I thought the hard part of my life was behind me. 3 deployments. 2 wars. A knee replacement at 54. I'd earned quiet. What I got instead was a divorce, a courthouse that stripped me of nearly everything I'd built, and a storage unit in Clarksville, Tennessee, full of boxes I hadn't opened in 4 years. The divorce wasn't dramatic. That almost made it worse. My wife, Brenda, didn't leave me for someone else. She left me for the version of herself she thought she'd buried when we got married at 26. 31 years we were together. She told me in March of 2021, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, that she had been slowly disappearing for decades, and she needed to find out who she actually was before she ran out of time to do it. I couldn't argue with that. I'd been gone too much. I knew it. She knew it. Our son, Marcus, knew it. He was 30 at the time, living in Nashville, and when I called to tell him his mother and I were separating, there was a silence on the line that told me he wasn't entirely surprised. The legal part took 18 months and cost me more than I want to say out loud. I had a good lawyer, but Brenda had a better one. The house in Clarksville went to her, which was fair. She'd raised Marcus in that house mostly alone while I was overseas. The retirement account was split. The savings were split. The truck I'd bought cash in 2018 was split, which meant I got a check half its value and had to buy something older. By the fall of 2022, I was renting a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on a street where the traffic never fully stopped, living on my Army pension, and a part-time job doing inventory audits for a hardware chain. I was not a man who felt sorry for himself. I had seen too much for that. But I will tell you honestly that there were mornings when I sat on the edge of that bed before sunrise and didn't have a single good reason to stand up. It was Marcus who told me about the property. He called me on a Tuesday in February, out of the blue, and asked if I had ever heard of a place called Harlan's Creek. I told him no. He said that, apparently my father, his grandfather, a man I had a complicated relationship with and who had died in 2014, had owned a piece of land out in rural Stewart County, a small building on about 4 acres. He'd left it to me in a will that had gone through probate so quietly I'd never been informed. Marcus had been doing some genealogy research, of all things, and had stumbled across a property tax record with my name attached to it. I told him that couldn't be right. He texted me a screenshot of the county assessor's record. There it was. Francis Allen Calloway. Parcel ID. A half-mile down a gravel road off Highway 149. I drove out there on a Saturday morning. It took me 40 minutes from Clarksville, the last 10 of which were on a road that seemed to get narrower the farther I went, bare trees pressing in on both sides like they were curious about me. When I found the right turnoff, there was no mailbox, no sign, nothing to indicate that anything was down there worth finding. The building was a long, low structure, part storage, part workshop, the kind of thing a working man builds himself over a few years using whatever lumber and corrugated metal he can get cheap. Maybe 60 feet long, maybe 20 wide. Beside it, a second smaller structure that might have been a tool shed or an outhouse at some point, hard to say. The whole property backed up against a narrow creek that I could hear but not quite see through the winter brush. Everything was locked. Padlocks on the main door, padlock on the shed. The kind of heavy old master locks that don't rust through even after a decade of weather. I wrote down the padlock sizes and drove back to Clarksville. I had a locksmith out there 3 weeks later, on a warm afternoon in early March. He got the main building open in about 4 minutes and charged me $60, which I thought was reasonable. The inside smelled like machine oil and thyme. There were shelves along both walls, most of them empty, a few holding old coffee cans with screws and bolts, some paint-stiffened brushes, a coil of copper wire. A workbench ran along the back wall. Under the workbench, a row of metal filing cabinets, 4 of them, all locked. On the workbench itself, neatly arranged, as if someone had just set them there, though they must have been sitting for years, 3 ledger books, the kind with hard black and white speckled covers. I picked one up and opened it. The handwriting inside was my father's. I recognized it from birthday cards he'd sent when I was a boy, before things between us got complicated. Small, precise, forward-slanting letters. Dates running down the left margin. Entries that I couldn't immediately parse numbers. Abbreviations. What looked like map coordinates. I set the ledger down and looked around the building for a while, not touching anything else yet. Something about the precision of it bothered me. My father had been a rough man in many ways, a Korean War veteran, a farmer, not someone I associated with careful record-keeping. But these ledgers were meticulous. And those filing cabinets were locked with the same quality of padlock as the door. Someone had wanted this protected. I took photographs of everything on my phone and drove home. The next 3 weeks were strange. I went back to the property twice more, just to stand there and think. I pulled the county records on the parcel and found that the property taxes had been paid consistently every year since my father's death, paid through a small trust account whose administrator was listed as a local law firm in Dover, Tennessee, an attorney named Gerald Finch. I called the number. It was disconnected. Then, the letters started arriving. The first one came in late March, addressed to me at my Clarksville apartment, which meant someone had looked me up. It was from a company called Meridian Land Holdings LLC, based in Nashville. Very professional letterhead. The letter said they had become aware that I was the owner of a parcel in Stewart County, and that they were interested in making an offer. They appreciated that the property might have sentimental value, and wanted to handle any transaction with sensitivity and fairness. They offered $40,000, cash, closing in 30 days. I looked up the parcel's assessed value. It was listed at $11,000. I set the letter on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. The second letter came 2 weeks later from a different company, Clearwater Development Partners. Different letterhead, different law firm, same general language, similar offer. $45,000 this time. I called Marcus. He said it sounded like a bidding war and maybe I should hire a real estate attorney. I said maybe so. But what I was thinking was something different. I was thinking about why 2 separate companies would be willing to pay 4 times the assessed value for a locked-up workshop on 4 acres in rural Tennessee, on a property that had been sitting unused for a decade. I went back out to Harlan's Creek. This time I brought bolt cutters. The filing cabinets took some work. The first 2 held mostly what I expected, old farm records, equipment receipts going back to the 1970s, correspondence about a parcel of land my father had sold in 1988. But the third cabinet held something different. Hanging files, neatly labeled in that same precise handwriting. The labels read like a timeline. 1,987. 1,988. 1,989. 1,990. Each folder thick with papers. I took the 1,989 folder out and sat on a stool at the workbench and started reading. My father, it turned out, had been a witness. In the late 1980s, a chemical company called Telford Processing had operated a facility about 6 miles up the road. They processed industrial solvents, cleaning compounds, degreasers, the kind of chemicals that manufacturing plants used by the barrel. I had never heard of Telford Processing. The company no longer existed under that name. But according to what my father had documented methodically, over years, in those ledgers and these files, Telford had been dumping. Not into the air, not into public waterways where inspectors might notice. Into the ground. Specifically, into a series of drainage channels that ran beneath several privately held parcels in the area, including my father's land, which sat downstream from the Telford facility. The chemicals had been working their way into the creek that ran behind his building for years. He had water samples in labeled mason jars, dated and annotated. He had photographs, old Polaroids, and developed film prints showing drainage pipes that he'd found on his property that hadn't been there when he bought the land. He had maps he'd drawn himself showing where the pipes ran and where they led. He had tried to report it. There were copies of letters he'd sent to the State Environmental Agency, to the County Health Department, to 2 different attorneys. The responses he'd kept were bureaucratic brush-offs. One letter from a state official, a man whose title indicated he worked in the Environmental Compliance Division, was particularly cold. My father had written back to that official twice more. No further response. He had also documented the pressure. Letters from Telford's attorneys. A visit from a man he described only as the company's local representative, who had come to the property and offered to buy it for what my father called a fair price. My father had refused. He had documented the visit, the offer amount, and the date. He had also noted without comment that 2 days after that visit, one of his outbuildings had burned down under circumstances that the county fire marshal called undetermined. I sat at that workbench for a long time. Telford Processing had closed in 1994. But the chemicals they'd put in the ground didn't close. They were still there. And whatever land those drainage channels ran under my father's 4 acres, and however many others whoever owned that land now had the potential standing to pursue something. Maybe a significant something. That's what those letters had been about. That was why my parcel was suddenly worth $45,000 in cash from a company that wanted to close in 30 days. Someone knew what was buried under the ground of Harlan's Creek. And they wanted to own that land before I figured it out. I was driving back to Clarksville when my phone rang. Number I didn't recognize. I answered. The man on the other end said his name was Robert Telford. He said he was the son of the man who had founded Telford Processing. He said he understood I had recently come into possession of a property in Stewart County that had some history he'd like to discuss. He said he would prefer to do so in person, and that he was prepared to make me an offer that would be considerably more generous than anything I'd received in writing. I said I was listening. He said he could offer $200,000. Cash? No contingencies. I said I would think about it. He said he hoped I would think quickly, because he had reason to believe there were other parties interested in the property, and he wanted to conclude this before things got complicated. I thanked him for calling and ended the call. Then I pulled off the road, put the truck in park, and sat there for a few minutes watching a hawk work a fence line in a field nearby. Patient bird. Watching everything. Waiting. That evening, I called Marcus. I told him most of what I'd found, the files, the ledgers, the documentation of the dumping. He was quiet for a moment, and then asked what I was going to do. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I was not selling the land to anyone named Telford. Marcus said, "Dad, you should talk to an environmental attorney." That was good advice. I found one through a lawyer I'd used in Clarksville. Her name was Dr. Patricia Wren. She had both a law degree and a chemistry background, which turned out to matter, and her office was in Nashville. I drove down on a Monday morning and sat across from her desk and laid out everything I had. The files. The water samples, which I'd carefully transported in a cooler. The photographs. The ledgers. The letters I'd received from the development companies. The phone call from Robert Telford. She looked through everything for about 45 minutes while I drank bad coffee from a paper cup. Then she looked up and said, "Your father was a very organized man." I said I hadn't always thought so when I was growing up, but I was revising my opinion. She said the documentation was remarkable not just in volume but in the kind of careful corroboration that environmental cases required. multiple types of evidence, a clear timeline. My father had essentially built a legal record without knowing how to build a legal record. He had done it the way a soldier does it, I thought, because he believed in thoroughness, and because he knew that nobody was going to believe him without proof. The water samples were old, she cautioned me. Whether they would still show contamination levels sufficient to support a claim would depend on independent testing. But the documentation of what had been done, the pipes, the timeline, the cover-up, that was a different matter. She also told me something I hadn't fully understood. The development companies that had written to me weren't just trying to buy land. Whoever currently held liability for Telford Processing's environmental violations, and that chain of liability could run through several corporate successors, would have significantly less exposure if they could establish ownership or legal control over the affected parcels before a remediation claim was filed. My father's property sat at a critical point in the drainage chain. Without it, any legal action became considerably more complicated. By buying my land, they weren't getting a workshop on 4 acres. They were buying silence. I asked her what we could do. She said it depended on what the soil and water testing showed, and on how the liability chain ran, and on a number of other factors she would need to research. But she said that if the documentation held up, and if the testing confirmed ongoing contamination, we were potentially looking at a significant environmental remediation case. Potentially class action, depending on how many adjacent parcels were affected. I drove home thinking about my father. About the man I had spent most of my life trying not to think about, who had been cold when I needed warmth, and distant when I needed presence, and who had managed to communicate disappointment more effectively than affection for most of our years together. I thought about him sitting in that building, alone, year after year, documenting something that nobody around him seemed to care about. Writing letters to officials who ignored him. Refusing to sell to people who pressured him. Keeping those files locked in those cabinets. He'd been a hard man to know. But he had not been a man who quit. That was where I came from. The testing took 6 weeks. The results were not ambiguous. The creek running behind the property showed compounds consistent with industrial solvent contamination at levels that exceeded federal standards. The soil samples were worse. The contamination had been there long enough that it had become part of the local geology of that small valley, working its way through the water table, down toward a larger tributary that fed into a reservoir used by 2 small towns downstream. Patricia filed a notice of intent. Within 2 weeks, we had responses from 3 different law firms representing, respectively, a chemical conglomerate in Atlanta that had acquired Telford Processing's assets in 1996, the current owners of the former Telford facility site, and Meridian Land Holdings LLC, which turned out to be a subsidiary of the same Atlanta parent company. They were all the same people. They'd just been hoping I wouldn't notice. Robert Telford called me twice more. Both times I let it go to voicemail. Both times he left messages that started professionally and ended with a kind of careful urgency, the voice of a man used to getting what he wanted who was beginning to sense that he might not get it this time. It took 14 months. I won't make it sound simpler than it was, because it wasn't. There were depositions. There were countersuits. There were weeks where Patricia called me to say the other side had filed something new and we needed to respond, and the bill was going to be significant. There were nights in my apartment above the dry cleaner when I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my father's ledger. I had kept it, that one, and reminded myself what I was doing and why. The settlement came in the spring. It covered remediation of the contaminated parcels, compensation for property owners along the affected water channels, and a fund for health monitoring of residents in the 2 downstream communities. My portion, after Patricia's fees, was enough to buy a house. A real house, with a yard and a garage and a neighborhood where kids rode bikes after school. But that comes later. I need to tell you about the man in the basement. I was there on a Tuesday evening in late November, the year before all of this resolved. It was the first time I'd been back to the property since the testing. We had been keeping a legal distance while the case developed. But Patricia had cleared me to go back, and I had some reason to check on the smaller shed behind the main building, which she wanted fully documented. I pulled in at dusk. I walked to the main building, which I now kept unlocked since I'd had the files removed to a secure location. I pushed the door open and felt along the wall for the light switch. I'd run an extension cord and a work light during my earlier visits. The light clicked on. In the far corner of the building, in the wooden chair I'd left beside the workbench, sat an old man. 70 or older. White hair, close-cropped. A green canvas jacket with worn-through elbows. Work boots caked with old mud. He had a flashlight in his lap, pointed at the floor, and he was watching me with eyes that were sharp and still and not at all frightened. For 3 full seconds, neither of us moved. Then he said, "I wondered when you'd finally come back." My hand went to the 45 on my hip and stopped. Whatever the threat assessment had been in that first second, it resolved itself quickly. He was old. He was alone. He was not afraid. He was not the posture of a man who was up to something dangerous. I stood in the doorway and said, "Who are you?" It was not a question. It came out like a command, which is something the army does to a person. He seemed to recognize the tone. He said his name was Dorsey. Harold Dorsey. He said he had owned the property 3 parcels over to the north, going on 40 years. He said he had known my father. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. I said, "You've been coming here." He said he'd been watching the property on and off since my father died. Not every day, he was too old for that, but often enough. He said he'd been here 3 times after I first showed up in the winter. He said he had been waiting to see what I would do. I asked him why he hadn't just come and talked to me. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I needed to know what kind of man you were first." I pulled a stool over from the workbench and sat down, and I asked him to tell me what he knew. He told me most of what I'd already figured out from the files, but he told it from the outside, from the perspective of a neighbor who had watched and stayed quiet for 30 years because he was afraid. His well had gone strange in the early 1990s. He'd stopped drinking the water but hadn't said anything publicly because a man from Telford had come by one day and had a conversation with him that Harold described, carefully, as the kind of conversation where you understand what the other person is really saying without them having to say it. His wife had been sick in the late 1990s. She had died in 2004. He did not say directly that the contaminated water had anything to do with it. He didn't have to. The way he looked at the floor when he mentioned her told me everything about the weight he had been carrying. He said my father had come to him a few times, trying to get him to document his own well water, to be a second witness. Harold had refused. He said this with a directness that I respected. No excuse-making, no self-pity, just a plain acknowledgement. He had been afraid, and he had said no, and my father had kept documenting alone anyway. He said when he saw me start coming back to the property, saw me hauling those filing cabinets out, saw the attorneys arriving, he said something in him had settled. He said, "Your daddy did what I wouldn't do. You're finishing it." We sat in that building for a while longer, not saying much. The kind of quiet that 2 men fall into when the words have run out, but the company is still right. Before I left, I asked him how he'd been getting in. He pointed to a corner of the back wall where one of the metal panels had been cut and refastened with a hook and eye latch done years ago, by my father, Harold said, so Harold could have access. My father had done that deliberately, had given the old man a way in, knowing Harold might need it someday. Even after Harold had refused to help him, my father had left the door open. Harold became the second claimant in Patricia's case. His documentation was less formal than my father's, but his testimony about his wife's illness, his contaminated well, and the conversation with the Telford representative was significant. The defendant's attorney tried to dismiss him as an elderly man with a fading memory. Harold sat in that deposition room and answered every question in the same flat, level tone he'd used sitting in my basement. He did not get flustered. He did not get emotional. He was the kind of witness you build a case around. After the settlement was announced, I drove out to Harlan's Creek one last time. Not for any legal reason, just because I wanted to. The property was still mine. The contamination had been formally acknowledged, remediation funds had been allocated, the EPA was involved now in ways that couldn't be undone. The creek behind the building was the same as it had always been, moving quietly through the brush, dark and cold in the March light. I went inside the main building and stood for a while at the workbench where my father had kept his ledgers. The surface was bare now. I ran my hand along the wood, which was smooth in the middle from years of use and rough at the edges. The work of a careful man. A man who believed things needed to be recorded, preserved, kept safe against the possibility that someday they would matter. My father and I had lost years to silence, to the distance between us that had started when I left for the army at 18 and never fully closed. There were things I had never said to him and things he had never said to me, and at 63 I understood that was not going to change. But I understood something else now, too. He had known that property would come to me. He had kept those files locked and that trust account funded and those padlocks solid, waiting. He had kept a neighbor's door unlocked, waiting. He had left me something to find. He hadn't known how to tell me he loved me, but he had spent 30 years making sure that when it mattered, I would have what I needed to stand up. Marcus drove out to meet me that afternoon. He stood next to me in the doorway of the building, looking around at the empty shelves and the workbench and the filed-out filing cabinets, and he said, "So this is it?" I said yes. He said, "Grandpa did all of this by himself?" I said he did. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like someone I'd have wanted to know better." I told him that made two of us. We walked down to the creek together. The water was running clear over flat stones, moving south the way it always had, carrying whatever it carried toward, wherever it was going. The trees along the bank were just beginning to think about budding, not there yet, but getting ready. A beginning that had been building through the cold for months, unnoticed, patient. I stood there with my son for a while and didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. The case was settled. The remediation had started. The towns downstream would have their water monitored. Harold Dorsey had enough money to fix his roof and his well and a few other things he'd been postponing for years. None of it brought anyone's wife back. None of it gave me 30 extra years with my father. None of it unspent the years I had been away when Marcus was growing up, or put back the marriage I had let thin out from distance and absence. The world doesn't actually make you whole for what it takes. That's not how any of this works. But standing there by that creek, in the early spring light, with my son standing next to me in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking at the water the same way his grandfather must have looked at it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Like I was standing in the right place. Like I had earned the ground under my feet. My father had been a hard man who left me a hard thing to do in a hard time. And I had done it. And that was enough. It was, I thought, maybe even exactly right. Sometimes the people who couldn't say, "I love you," found other ways to say it through locked cabinets, paid tax bills, and a latch left open for a neighbor who once said no. Frank's father never gave him warmth, but he gave him truth, preserved and waiting. Whatever distance exists between you and someone you've lost, look closer. The love might already be there, just waiting to be found. A small note worth sharing: this story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to offer you a moment of entertainment and, perhaps, a quiet reminder that the people who shaped us left more behind than we realize.